So today we're going to talk about 5.7 meat production methods. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify different methods of meat production and describe the benefits and drawbacks of these methods of meat production. So our goal is, or to accomplish this goal, we're first going to describe what's called CAFO methods and free-range methods of animal production. So here are two different ways that meat animals are grown for production. The top is what's called a concentrated animal feeding operation. The bottom is what we call free range, or animals that are allowed to spend time out on pasture. So the top one is also called a feedlot. Perhaps you've heard that term before, where animals are densely crowded together and fed diets to raise them as quickly as possible. So the goal here is you want to maximize your land use and maximize your profits. More animals in a smaller space means maximized profits. On the flip side, we have free range, which are animals that are allowed to roam freely outdoors. Caveat here is it means for at least part of the day. It doesn't necessarily mean all the time. So pros of a feedlot is that it minimizes the cost of meat for consumers. So that's what really drives these feedlots, is that consumers demand affordable meat. The free range process is good because waste is dispersed over the land naturally and acts as a fertilizer, and that the animals can graze in areas that are not usable for crops. So much more rocky areas that are not quite as flat and that would be difficult to farm for crops, you can put cattle on them, or sheep, or goats. We do have some downsides though. Feedlots generate large amounts of waste. You think you have more animals in a smaller space, that also makes more manure in a smaller space. These animals are fed diets to raise them as quickly as possible, so they're generally not fed diets that are ideal for their intestinal system, which leads to a higher usage of antibiotics and also produces a larger amount of CO2, CH4, which is methane, and N2O. The free range is not without its own disadvantages. It requires more total land usage, which, as we know, is a concern. It's more expensive for the consumer, and it can lead to overgrazing and thus topsoil erosion. Another issue with feedlots, here's a concentrated pig farm, and you see that we have a lagoon here, and so they take all the pig waste and they settle it in a lagoon so they can take the liquid off the top and then recycle the nutrients. However, as you can see here, this lagoon is so rich in nutrients, it's turned pink from all the algae, and then with the hurricane that hit North Carolina, all of that waste full of E. coli and algae washed out into local waterways, which can contaminate local drinking water and local waterways. So cattle grazing. Cattle grazing can be heavy grazing or light grazing. So it can lead to the removal of vegetation. We know that removing vegetation from the ground can lead to erosion. Animals compacting the soils can decrease the water holding capacity. So when the soils are pushed together, it takes up all those spaces, means there's no space for water to be held. And then the loss of vegetation can lead to desertification, particularly when combined with those compacted soils. So if there's no more space in there, they can't hold water, they become dried out, and we have desertification. But when done appropriately, using rotational grazing to prevent the overgrazing, you can get very healthy and well-managed pastures. So here is a rotational grazing system. I think we've looked at one of these before. It's good to remind ourselves because it's important. This is when you're rotating your animals through the pastures regularly before they've completely destroyed the available grasses, and then not putting them back there until the grass has had a chance to recover. So it turns out grazing actually can increase your grass growth, just like cutting your lawn can make it come back in thicker and more healthy. Cutting the grass before it reaches maturity will have it come back in even stronger and build even deeper roots in order to reach those nutrients. It's also important that you graze your cattle when it's at the height of its nutrients, because when it gets past a certain point, the nutrient value is quickly declined and they're going to need to eat more of the available forage just to get the same amount of nutrients. Some people use what's called regenerative grazing, and they actually use animals to rejuvenate an area into a usable area for cattle. So you can see we've talked about many of these things. So in the original method they talk about here, they went from using annual plants to perennials, from a monoculture to a polyculture. Instead of just focusing on parts, they were managing wholes, and instead of trying to control the ground, they're trying to make it do what it does naturally better. You can see the huge difference in all of the vegetation in this area. However, as we're talking about meat production, it's important to note that meat production is less efficient than agriculture, than growing crops, because it takes 20 times more land to produce the same amount of calories from meat as it does from plants. So this is a concern when trying to feed a growing population if it takes more land than it does with plants. So we can see that the average land use with beef or mutton, which is sheep, is about 1 square meter versus all the way down here, wheat, rice, corn, and pulses, which would be our legumes, take 0.02 meters squared, 0.01 meters squared, and 0.01 meters squared. That's a significant reduction. So to summarize, our goal was to identify different methods of meat production and describe the benefits and drawbacks of these methods. What we've learned today is that there are many ways to raise animals for meat production. However, no matter which way you grow them, meat is an inefficient use of land available when compared to any other crop.